thank you very much for coming, and I'm so excited that so many of you have the book itself in your hands already. That's very thrilling for an author to see. This is West Kennet Long Barrow in Wiltshire. It's a chambered tomb from the Neolithic, the late Stone Age, which makes it about 5,500 years old. And I first visited this site when I was about 18 years old on a university field trip. And we walked up to the site and our tutors invited us to explore it for ourselves. So I went in and there's a 13-metre long passage into the earthen mound, and it's created from huge sarsen boulders. And as you walk in, there are 2 chambers on each side and a 5th chamber at the very end. And these were chambers that were used for burying men, women and children from the Neolithic community, but not in whole pieces of, not as whole bodies, but as disarticulated remains. So there's been a lot of activity been done with the dead bodies before they even reach the tombs. They've been laid out or excarnated, and the bones have been picked clean by birds, by animals, the flesh has rotted away, and once the bones are scoured clean, they've been collected up and placed into the tombs. And it's thought that in the Neolithic, the practice symbolises that you stop being an individual, you stop being Mary Ann, you become part of the ancestors. So walking into the tomb, I had this knowledge in my mind that this is a tomb of the ancestors. And admittedly, you go in and you have a very visceral, or I certainly did, had a very visceral response to the place. You can almost feel the weight of the earth and the stone above you. It feels colder, it's darker. You go in and right at the very back, I was looking, and admittedly, my first thought was, this is a really cool, spooky old tomb. And then realised that I should probably have some slightly more enlightened intellectual archaeological thoughts about the site. And as I was walking back out, my tutor said to me, "Oh, have you noticed these marks on the stone just by the entrance?" And there were 2 parallel grooves in the rock. And he said, these are created by late Neolithic people polishing ceremonial axe heads. And the grooves have been created by the thousands of repetitions of polishing a heavier stone against the sarsen. It's called a polissoir. And it was used for that purpose before the stone was brought to West Kennet and incorporated into the tomb. And this blew my mind. To think that I kind of felt that I'd been at the beginning of history for this place, the start of the story, and then realised that actually no, there's so many more clues in the very stone, in the very fabric of the tomb around me. I hadn't even noticed those marks on the stone, and if I had noticed the marks, I wouldn't have known what they meant and what they represented. And then back outside the tomb, you're faced by this, an enormous edifice of standing stones laid out at the front. Some of them were original, constructed when the tomb was first constructed about 3,600 to 3,400 BC. But some of them were brought much, much later, around 2000 BC, when we're now in the Bronze Age, as a ritual closing up of the monument. People came back to this site when it was already 1,000, 1,500 years old. They wouldn't have known how old it was. It would have just been there forever. And they ritually closed it up. They filled it with soil, but they didn't fill it with soil just from the ditch next to the tomb. It appears that they brought soil from different places. And so the thought is that this was a closing up for the whole community in a much broader area. That people were bringing a bucket of soil to add, to seal up the ancestors, and they put these huge stones as a symbolic and as a very practical bar to entry. The reason you can go in now is because it's since been excavated, and so you can wander in and kind of hunker down in one of the little chambers which had these disarticulated remains. But the other thing about West Kennet is that when you step outside, you realise just how important it is to understand a monument like this in the context of the wider landscape. How does it fit with the natural topography? What views can you get from when you're approaching it, from when you're standing next to it, when you walk around it? How does it relate to the prehistoric ridgeway, an ancient trackway that runs along the high ground on the other side of the valley? At the bottom of the valley, there's a Swallowhead Spring, which is the source of the Kennet River. Just opposite, actually, you can see on this photograph, there's Silbury Hill, which is this huge monument that we'll talk about in a minute, a huge circular mound. On the next rise in the land, there's a site called Overton Down with huge timber monumental circle structures. No one's quite sure, but they think it was possibly a burial site to start off with and then had other ceremonial functions. And you only understand West Kennet when you look at it in its context, when you look at it within its place in the landscape. And I realised, and I think that was when the seed for this book was planted, I realised that if you know just a few of the things to look for, if you have just some of the clues to spot in the landscape around you, it starts to reveal a much bigger, much more interesting story. And for me, that's incredibly exciting, and hopefully lots of other people agree. Because when you're standing there, I think a lot of people, West Kennet Long Barrow is quite famous, but a lot of people will see the brown sign, they'll walk up, there's like a little information board with those slightly dodgy illustrations, and they don't really get much beyond that. You kind of go, oh, it's all right, and you stand on the top like I do, and you take a picture, and then off you go. But actually, if you have just some extra little hints about what to look for, boom, suddenly you've added 6,000 years of history to the landscape you're looking at. And not only that, you can start to pick out how other people treated this landscape, how farmers have respected this monument. It hasn't been ploughed out all that time. Partly probably because of the massive stones, and they're a bit of a schlep to get out of the way. But nonetheless, you kind of start to tell the story not only of the origins of a site and a monument, but how it's been treated through history. The book covers loads of stuff, so I'm going to romp through a few little features and leave the rest for you to do your own landscape spotting in your own good time. Okay, quick quiz, but it's not a test, there's no follow-up questions. Who knows what this is? Tumulus, or there's a plural here, tumuli. Latin scholars amongst you, or archaeologists, fans? No. Yeah, earth mound. It's from the Latin tumere, to swell. So it's a mound. In the flesh, they look like this. This is Bronckham Down in Dorset. And these are round barrows. They're from the Bronze Age. This is a time when they weren't doing the communal burying of the ancestors. They were burying individuals. And normally you have one either buried or cremated individual at the centre of an earthen mound, and then they've raised the mound above them. Sometimes you get additional cremations and burials kind of shoved into the sides, a bit like a family tomb or a family grave, where first of all it's one person's grave and then you put, grandma and grandpa in when they've popped their clogs. The thing about the barrows is that you get them in some extraordinary formations. This is Winterbourne Stoke in Wiltshire, which is an extraordinary collection of barrows. It's called the Barrow Cemetery. There's over 30, actually. And you can see that there are slightly different shapes, slightly different profiles. And in Britain, we have a good menu of barrows. You've got a bell barrow, which is a mound with a flat bit on either side, a berm, so it kind of has the profile of a bell. You have a bowl barrow, which, as you'd imagine, looks like an upturned bowl. But you also get weird ones like this one, which is a saucer barrow, where you've got an upturned rim, like a cup and saucer, but it's slightly depressed or flat in the middle. Now, no one's really quite sure. They always thought that, well, maybe if you get those slightly depressed or flattish barrows, but it turns out that it was a barrow, it's because the earth has been eroded away or ploughed down or dug out. But actually the earthwork, the circular edging has been retained. So perhaps it was always intended to be flat in the middle. Who knows what else might have been inside that circle of earth. If you see a barrow that has some kind of weird divot in the top, it's probably not original. It's probably a sign that it's been excavated, probably in antiquity. There was a real trend, there was a real hobby for digging into barrows in the 18th and 19th and probably early 20th centuries, before kind of modern archaeology really took off. And people were looking for treasure, effectively. They dug in. They knew from workmen and farmers, you know, every now and then something weird would pop up or something shiny and golden. So they'd dig in because they kind of thought, well, there must be burial mounds. Every now and then they would find gold or something precious, but most of the time, actually, what you'll get is a kind of a hastily written line in someone's journal saying, oh, and we got to the middle of the barrow and we didn't really find anything. There was some burnt bone, and so we threw that away and we carried on looking for the gold. Oh, heads in hands, because that is, for a modern archaeologist, the treasure. That was the burial. That's the thing that we can now learn so much from. So the ones that have strange divots in the top, they've been excavated. And some of the results of those excavations, some of the finds, some of the artefacts, some of the bones will be available to view in local museums or online. Those that haven't have either been excavated in modern times, and so the backfilling has been done better, so you can't actually see this sunken hole in the middle, or far more likely, because there's a round barrow in every parish in the country, there's thousands of them, and they're just the ones we know about. There must be loads that have been lost. Loads of them haven't ever been excavated. We don't actually know what's under there. We know what kind of type of monument it is, but we don't know what's under there or who's under there. So the next time you're driving along or going for a walk, look out for areas of otherwise cultivated land that have been protected. So you might see a ploughed field, but then there's a kind of a square of grass with a bit of a mound shape in the middle. That's because the round barrow is a scheduled monument, and so it can't be ploughed. And so if you see a weird patch of grass in the middle of a field, your landscape spotting ears should be pricking up. Oh, what is it? What could it be? What can I see? What sort of profile? If it's a footpath, have a walk around. See if you can see any ditches around it. Normally there was a ditch that encircled the mound. Now you might not actually be able to see an actual ditch anymore, but you might be able to tell in terms of the difference of vegetation. Because even though these were created 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, there's still differences in the soil structure. And so different plants will prefer to grow in the ditch soil. You might get greener grass, you might get taller grass, and you might sometimes feel it a little bit softer and wetter underfoot. There are, however, as is always the way with landscape spotting, loads of red herrings for your mound hunting. These, anyone know what these are? They're not archaeological, they are moraines. They're a glacial feature. And these are at the top of Mardale Head in the Lake District. They're effectively created by a glacier chuntering down a valley and dumping gravel out of the bottom. And then over thousands or tens of thousands of years, they've grassed over, they've smoothed over. So if you see this, you go, oh, looks like a barrow cemetery. It's exciting. It's no, probably not. If you're at the bottom of Glacial Valley, probably not. You also get kind of longish ones, lateral moraines, where the gravel has been dumped out either side, or drumlins as well. So they look a bit like long barrows, but again, if you're in a glacial landscape, then be wary. This is Silbury Hill, which is opposite West Kennet Long Barrow in Wiltshire. If you want a day trip to go and visit some amazing British archaeology out of London, I would say go to Wiltshire. You could even bypass Stonehenge, stop and have a quick look at it. But actually go to West Kennet Long Barrow, go to Avebury, go to Silbury Hill, and you've got a really fantastic world-class, it's part of a World Heritage Site, and rightly so. Silbury Hill is the largest man-made mound in Europe. It's estimated to have taken about 4 million man-hours of labour, and it comprises about 500,000 tonnes of chalk and soil. We don't really know why it was constructed. It was built in about 2400 BC, so just at the cusp of the turning point from the Stone Age, the late Stone Age, the Neolithic, to the Bronze Age. So the introduction of metalworking, different cultural practices in terms of the burial, you've moved away from communal, you've moved towards individual burial, suggests that actually there's a different power structure in society. That it's not about the ancestors, it's not about communality, it's not about shared ownership necessarily. It might be more about hierarchy and wealth of individuals and strength and power of individuals. And when you look at a monument like this, it's possibly also about myth-making about individuals. The king from which we are all descended. The one who was here way before us, who was mightier, who was greater, who was, I don't know, demigod. We don't know, we have to fill in the blanks. Now the archaeologists say, oh, don't know, no, only we can guess at what it is. That's not true, we can all guess. Because if you feed yourself with the pieces of information, filling in the blanks, making that leap of imagination is something that we're all entitled to do. The weird thing about Silbury Hill is that they thought it was, the kind of the folklore story is that it was King Sil with a golden chariot in the middle. And his horses. And King Sil and his golden chariot did not appear when they dug into the mound. They tried to dig in from the top, they tried to dig in from the side, and then in the 1960s they tried to dig in from the other side. And it was only in 2007 that English Heritage went, okay, we think that it's kind of a bit Edam cheese in there, we need to sort this out and fill in the holes. So they excavated, and what they discovered was that they confirmed its date, but what they also discovered is that it started off as quite a small mound. It seems to have started off as like a regular round barrow and then went poof, round barrow on steroids. No one really knows why, and it's yours to explore and wonder. There are loads of other mounds in Britain. Britain is full of lumps and bumps. This is a motte. In Oxford. It's a Norman motte, so they were raised by the Normans after the 1066 conquest as a kind of short, sharp, we're now in charge. This was actually built in the middle of the Saxon town, so people would have been cleared out of their homes and probably enslaved to provide the labour, the pure grunt work. And you'd have a bailey, an enclosure around the outsides, and then a motte, this earthen mound, nice sharp sides, flat top, and you put a wooden structure on the top, very defensible, not very comfortable, and they think probably flat packed. They think that Normans were great. They were great at fighting and invading. You can debate the morality, but they were really great at kind of doing a kind of big push. And so what they would do was establish a perimeter, very much like modern military now, establish a perimeter, defend the perimeter, and then you can build within. And this is not just about might, it's also about defensibility. And the reason they used flat pack, sort of prefab pieces, is that they could move their bits of castle to the next hotspot. So much like modern military, you get your kit to the front line, you establish a perimeter, you establish your defences, and then you can do your patrolling, policing, and smiting from there. And then, how many of you have driven up and down the A40? Does this look familiar? As you're driving out towards the turn-off for Heathrow, 4 huge hills come into view. As you're driving out of London, they're on the left. They're called Northala Fields, and they are monumental mounds. But they weren't constructed in prehistory. They were constructed not that long ago from the remains of the Wembley Stadium and the foundations of the Westfield Shopping Centre. As far as we know, there's no one buried under them. Okay. How many of you go walking ever, wandering up hills? Yeah? Oh, yay. You walk to the top of a hill and you see a cairn, a mound of stones. Some of them are navigational cairns, so when you're standing at the top of Starfell Pike and you don't know quite which way to go and you see a bit of a cairn through the cloud and the fog and the snow and the mist, you're on the way. Some of them are walkers' cairns, where they might not actually be that much use navigationally speaking, but everyone who's trekked up there sort of sees a mound and you can't help, it's human instinct to pick up a stone and stick one on top. I've been there too. But underneath some of them are the remains of, again, prehistoric burial monuments. Because in the lowland areas where you've got soil, people would construct an earthen mound. In the upland areas where you haven't got that much soil, people would construct the same mound, the same monument style, but they'd use stone. So you get a cairn, a burial cairn. Now, the thing that you're looking for the next time you trundle up to the top of a hill and you kind of go, oop, is this a archaeological cairn or just a cairny cairn? On an Ordnance Survey map, if you see that Gothic typeface that tumulus was written in, then it indicates it's an archaeological feature. That someone has gone along, surveyed it and said, yes, this is a thing. It's not just a mound because a farmer wanted to put a silo on top or someone was digging sand and that's the quarrying remains. If it says it in Gothic typeface, it's archaeological. If it says tumulus, then you know it's a burial mound. If it says cairn in Gothic typeface, then you know it's a burial cairn, an archaeological ancient cairn. It's exciting because sometimes you get really cool little insights. Sometimes you've got a modern cairn hiding under totally hiding what prehistory might be underneath, but sometimes not. This is near I can't ever say Brecneog, forgive my pronunciation, in the Brecon Beacons. And actually you can see the remains of what would have probably been a standing shelter of stones. And in the middle, a stone kist, a stone box in which cremated remains would have been placed. So next time you're at a cairn or a kind of a weird collection of stones somewhere, look on the Ordnance Survey map. If it says that a cairn is marked, then you're looking for archaeological evidence. Look to see if you can see any evidence of curbstones that mark out the original circle that encompassed the monument. Look for anything that's depressed and any stones that are laid down vertically into the earth, because they might be the remains of a kist. And if you see big stones like this, you may be dealing with the remains of what was some kind of chambered monument that was then covered by earth. So those dolmens, I don't know if you've seen dolmens where you've kind of got like an improbable capstone balancing on verticals. They would probably have been mostly covered by earth. And what remains is the stones. But somewhere like this, the earth has gone, or the earth probably wasn't ever there because it's upland. So it would have had a stone capping and larger stones to create some kind of central box. But this is what we're left with. Okay, let's talk trees. London is really good for ancient trees, actually. You've got Highgate Wood in the north, you've got Epping Forest, absolutely fantastic, and the Woodland Trust actually have an ancient tree database with more than 110,000 ancient trees, which is pretty cool. If you see any fat old trees that they don't know about, then tell them, because they want to know about them. In ancient woodlands, however, what you're looking for is signs of modification. So in Highgate Wood and Epping Forest, you're looking for three key ways that trees have been modified. The first on the top is a coppice. So you cut a broadleaf tree down low at the base and it encourages it to shoot new growth. So from one root base you get lots of trunks. Now what you're looking for are trees with sort of a glove, of fingers of trunks that have all grown up, because what we're looking for is a medieval forestry practice that has effectively been stopped in time. Ancient woodlands in Britain are officially designated if they've been permanently wooded from 1600 AD in England and Wales and 1750 in Scotland. That's not because Scottish trees grow incredibly differently. It's just because of the records that are available. So they went, oh, well, we can't get further back than 1750, so we'll just make our peace with it being ancient if it's been there since 1750. But when you're looking at coppice trees now, there are actually modern woodlands which are still using these techniques. They're very good for woodland management. But when you're looking for ancient woodlands, you'll see kind of big trunks all coming out of one root base. That's the sign of a coppice that has been left to grow out. It's been neglected. These ones here, this is a pollard. Ancient woodlands in medieval times, through the Elizabethan times and on, up until the modern times really, were very, very hard-working parts of a land management system. They weren't for walking the dog and, building dens. They were for producing valuable timber and firewood and fencing and food for your animals, for digging resources that you'd need at home. So a lot of woodlands were also used for grazing animals on the understory. So if you had your coppiced trees and then you had deer perhaps coming in or cows, they would eat all the new shoots and you wouldn't actually end up with any timber. So what people would do was pod up pollard. So you let the tree grow up 2 to 3 metres high, sometimes 4 metres, which is quite high, and then you lop it off and encourage that new growth. So you get a pollard like this. This is a weird hybrid called a coppard, which is you coppice, you let it grow up, and then you pollard. So they call it a coppard. What you're looking for, as I said, are the fingers of trees. And you'll probably also see fingery trees near to large, standard, straight-growing trees, and they called them maidens. And Highgate Wood's a fantastic example. You've got oak standards, and you've got hornbeam coppices. And they're really fun to spot. I went out with my nephew, who's 5, and we wandered around the woodland. And we wandered around looking for 3ers and 4ers, which are coppices, and 1ers, which are oak standards. And we were talking about what the timber would have been used for in a time before steel, in a time before plastic. So we worked out, he ran around, he absolutely loved it. He ran around the forest looking for 3ers and 4ers that were used for fences and houses. And he used 1ers. What are they for? Ships. King's ships. Ships, 1ers, houses and fences, 3ers and 4ers. And it was, he's 5 and he was doing landscape spotting. And then we ran around more and we found an earthen bank, a wood bank, which would have marked out, distinguished an area of woodland that would have been managed slightly differently to the bit next door. When you're hunting out ancient woodlands, look also at place names as well. Holly trees were often used for feeding cattle in hard winters. So names with hollins indicates a stand of holly trees that would have been useful. If you're actually looking for ancient trees, however, don't look in ancient woodlands, because ancient woodlands were so heavily managed that no one ever let a tree grow to a great age. Because at a certain point, an ancient tree becomes hollow, it starts to decay, bits of it start to fall off, the canopy starts to retrench, and it becomes a fantastic resource for wildlife, but not that great for timber. If you're looking for an ancient tree, look in estates, large estates, stately homes, deer parks, places that perhaps once would have been wooded pasture, like bits of Epping, like Ashridge Estate in Hertfordshire. This magnificent beast is on Offa's Dyke, so it would have been used as a boundary marker, oak. What is the best way to age an ancient tree without chopping it down? Any guesses? Yes, girth. What's the most fun way to measure the girth of a tree? Hug it. With oak trees that are free growing and freestanding, so they haven't been coppiced or anything like that, bearing in mind that your arm span is about the same as your height, so based on being 1.5 metres tall, 2 hugs of an oak tree, 130 years old, it's not ancient yet, 3 hugs, 250 years old, That means that the oak tree is now officially ancient. There are oak trees in Britain that they think are over 1,000 years old, which is extraordinary, and they are monsters, absolute monsters. And it sort of feels like a privilege to be in their presence and think about what history they've lived through. But oak trees, on the grand scheme of ancient trees, are kind of the babies. They don't really last that long, all things considered. Yew trees are the granddaddies of them all. Yew trees are the longest living organisms in Europe, and incredibly, this still blows my mind, the oldest yew trees in Britain, and we've got the oldest yew trees in the whole of Europe. The oldest yew trees are between 4,000 and 5,000 years old. And the three oldest, which are named in the book, are all in churchyards. Now, they obviously massively predate Christianity. They predate the churchyard. But there's a very strong connection in Britain with yew trees being in churchyards and graveyards. No one's quite sure why. There are lots of different theories, but the most watertight theory is that yew trees were considered sacred in some way by pagan native British religions. And so when the early Christians turned up in the 4th and 5th centuries, they appropriated pagan sites because they were pretty clever and went, okay, well, we'll keep the sacred site, we'll just change the gods. And yew trees came with the landscape. And yew trees are actually fantastic in terms of the symbolism. It fits really well with Christianity because when you cut them, the sap that comes out is red. It looks like they're bleeding red. They're evergreen, so you can link it into notions of everlasting life. They've got red berries, which medieval people would link to the drops of blood that Christ, when he was crucified. And they never die. And so it's a really powerful way of expressing everlasting life, and the church being the way to achieve that. Briefly, because I've got like 2 minutes left, I've been chatting on about mounds too much. Standing stones, everyone loves a good old standing stone. You get them in circles, you get them in rows. Dartmoor's really good for stone rows. And you also get single standing stones, monoliths. This monster is called the Rudston monolith. It's in Yorkshire. It's 7.6 metres high, and surveys have shown that there's as much stone under the ground as there is above, which is pretty cool. It's about 36 tonnes, and it was probably dragged about 40 miles. They're not really sure. The reason that it's called Rudston, and the whole village is called Rudston, is because of this stone. The original name was Rood stone, rood being an Old English word for cross. And the reason it's got this lead capping on the top is because at some point someone drilled a hole into the top of the monolith and stuck a cross in the top, and it was used as a site for gathering open worship. So Rood, cross, stone. It's the name of the village. The stone has named the village. The other weird thing is that it's about 4 metres away from the edge of the parish church. And so they respected the standing stone, which is prehistoric, and must have really edged around it to not knock it over while they were constructing the church. But it just indicates just how important, how powerful sort of prehistoric monuments are, really. Even now, like hugging a standing stone is a thing of great joy for me. The one on the right, the Toblerone shape, or the shark's tooth, is on the Outer Hebrides near Lewis. It's near Callanish, which is also really, if you want a fun archaeological trip, I'd say go to the Outer Hebrides or the Orkney Islands. The Outer Hebrides, you can fly in from Glasgow. It's a British Airways flight, but you fly in and you land on the beach at low tide on the island of Barrows. It's really fun. When you're looking at standing stones, again, you're trying to work out what's the significance, why is it here, and what does it all mean? And to work out whether it's prehistoric standing stone, first of all, look for evidence of vertical weathering. If it's been standing upright for 3, 4, maybe 5,000 years, you'll see vertical erosion from where the rain has hit and run down. If it's been raised more recently, it might seem much smoother. Look for edges that appear to have kind of been machine cut. or bedding that suggests that it's more modern. And then also look out at the landscape. Is it in conjunction? Is it in some kind of connection with other monuments, with other ancient or prehistoric features in the landscape? Or, as I sort of memorably noticed once in a patch of Wales, kind of going, oh, standing stone in that field, and kind of trundled over to have a look at it, and then realised that there was actually a standing stone in the next field, and a standing stone in the next field, and they all happened to be in the middle of the fields. And then I realised that they were cattle rubbing stones for the cows to scratch their bottoms on, so that they wouldn't knock over gateposts. And I thought, well, it is a standing stone, but it's not the standing stone I was thinking it was going to be. Oh, come on. So I haven't touched on half of the stuff that's in the book. You can entertain yourselves in your own leisure for pub names. The reason we started off with medieval ale stakes and then ended up with hanging pub signs that you'll sometimes see curling ivy or kind of pretty metallic grapes laid over. Why you have red lions and black boys and golden deer and golden hinds. Why you can stare at a cottage and work out when it was constructed and how it's been modified. You can go to a pub in Suffolk and look for the mullion holes in the windows from the original timbers when it was created as a medieval hall house. You can wander through field systems like this and puzzle out how it was farmed and what significance it has. And the next time you walk past a dry stone wall, have a look at how it was constructed. If you see a hole at the base, then it might be used for sheep, for the shepherds to push the sheep through, and that's called a lunky hole. So there's really cool bits of trivia in the book, but hopefully my aim is to share that passion to get outside and to explore and to discover for yourself, and to stand in the landscape and wonder, what is it that I'm looking at, and what does it tell me about the story of the countryside around me? Thank you very much.
We do have time for questions. Please wait for the microphone. Yep.
Hello. So, looking at excavating mounds and the like, are there mounds that you think we should not excavate simply so there's something for the next generation to either explore? Or
That's a really good question. Archaeological excavation is inherently destructive because you dig into it and then it's not there anymore. And however much you preserve, there's stuff you're going to lose. And some of the antiquarians back in the 18th and 19th centuries did a terrible job and were just looking for treasure. They were effectively nighthawks. But others were doing the utmost within the terms of that era to be as scientific and rigorous as possible. And so you get really beautiful pen and ink sketches. But for a modern researcher, that's not always that useful because you've lost all the organic remains. You haven't got any samples that you can date. You haven't got accurate records of what was where and how it was aligned and associated with all the other things. So I think it's inevitable that people in the future will look at the excavations that people are doing now and go, what the heck were they doing? They just had no idea how much material and how much information they were losing. So I think it's definitely advisable to not dig it all up just because we can. Well, actually we can't because it's expensive and we haven't got any money. But nonetheless, money notwithstanding, it's valuable to leave stuff as is. And the growth in archaeology now is in non-destructive techniques. So ground penetrating radar, imaging techniques from aerial images. We can record artifacts much more carefully now with photogrammetry, where you're creating a kind of 3D point cloud, so you get absolute accuracy of information. Dating techniques are coming on apace as well. But again, if you want to radiocarbon date something, you have to drill a hole into it and take out a sample. So again, you kind of have to choose what questions you want to answer. Yeah. So yeah, leave some of it alone, I think.
Hi, you talked about a couple of databases, but I'm wondering on the whole how well recorded and databased this stuff is. And I guess I'm thinking from a maps and apps sort of point of view.
There isn't a really good app. There isn't a really good app where you can say, a kind of a Shazam for archaeology where you go, what is that? And it'll go, well, you're here and this is that. There are databases now that are being developed by Historic Scotland, by Historic England, where they've brought together the historic environment records, sites and monuments records, so these legal documents that schedule a monument, as well as surveys and the information that is attached to that. They are accessible. Most of them, they're all free to access. Some of them are online. The search functions aren't always great. You might miss stuff, but more and more they've got interactive maps. So if you actually know about Heritage Gateway, if you actually know about Pastscape, you can go and find the stuff. I think the problem is the general public don't necessarily know about it, and it might be slightly overwhelming to start off with because you have to kind of do a bit of wandering around to work out what it is you're looking at and to kind of read through the archaeology ease to understand what is it that they're telling me. This is a burial mound. It's from the Bronze Age, which is 2400 BC to about 800 BC. This is probably what's inside it. These are the excavations or surveys that have been done. Now go and have a look at it and find out these features and these features. That would be fantastic. It doesn't exist yet.
Any more questions? Yeah.
I would guess that some of these features, like the medieval tree management, would be common to sort of most of Western Europe. Are there things that are specific to Britain, like barrow shapes or anything like that?
Yeah, barrows we tend to share, chambered barrows, chambered tombs and long barrows we tend to share with the Atlantic seaboard, so the western coast. So you get them in western Spain and bits of Portugal, you get them across up through the western coast of France and Germany as well. Some of the medieval land management systems are quite specific to Britain. So we had great field systems that were very, very elaborate and well sort of managed in central and southern counties. And actually, when you see, if any of you have ever seen those fields of they look corrugated. They've kind of got those ridge and furrow running along. And it's normally under grass. And they're the evidence, they're the remains of medieval ploughing that has been then turned over to grass. And so those kind of corrugations have been preserved. Now, the reason that they're such big, wide ridge and furrow compared to like a modern plough furrow is because these fields were farmed communally, but different families had different strips. So you'd have this strip and I'd have this strip, and then in the next great field, you'd have a couple of strips and I'd have a few strips. And so the land would be shared out between the whole community. So it'd have some good stuff, some bad stuff. We'd work together, but we'd effectively farm our own little bits, but there weren't fields with hedges and fences like we imagine now. They were introduced in the 1750s to 1780s primarily as an act of parliament when they were enclosing common land. So that's a kind of a vast change, that you've got the remnants of these medieval ploughing systems, but you've also got the parliamentary enclosure fields, those lovely straight rectangular fields, what we kind of imagine as the green and pleasant land that we've all become accustomed to, is actually a function of a historical change that was massively traumatic for a huge swathe of the population, because they were booted out of land that they'd lived on forever. And there was a huge depopulation of the countryside because these new private landowners who would then fence off bits of land would chuck the peasants off. We'll put sheep on top. Sheep require 2 shepherds, whereas farming communally requires hundreds more people. So so that's a really good one in terms of like special British things. Crook frames are really good as well. When you look at the end of an old cottage and you see the kind of the curved beams that's been split from an oak, the same oak, so you kind of get normally oak, you get a kind of a mirror image. They're quintessentially British as well. And Wheeldin Hall houses, if you want a trip to Kent, go and have a look for Wheeldin Hall houses, which are really distinct and incredibly old. They used to be like the stately homes of their day, and now they look like kind of slightly tumbly down cottages, with a jettied first floor, and you would have had a central area with a kind of an open fire and a gallery for the servants, and then a kind of the top table up to the left, the dais. Yeah. So there's some really specific British things. If you go up to Scotland, actually, you get infield outfield farming systems. That picture of Wasdale, that's the Lake District, but it's a similar system because obviously the fell sides are quite hard to farm. They're quite there's not that much return on them. You can't cultivate them. But the valley floor is fertile-ish if you clear the stones away and you work really hard to nourish the soil over generation after generation. And so the community here, before they broke it up into these tiny fields, would have an set of infields which were heavily farmed and heavily manured, and then outfields that would be left fallow, so they'd be used on rotation. And then the fell sides would be common grazing. And in the Lake District, you think of it as a very natural environment. It's still grazed by commoners who get an allowance of sheep that they can put on the fell side. And that's why we've got the landscape we have today. That's why you've got those green and pleasant valleys and those what nominally appear to be kind of barren fell sides, but the Herdwick sheep that live up there are perfectly attuned because they've been there since the Vikings probably. The Vikings probably brought Herdwicks.
I have a question. So when you go and explore the British landscape, do you just think, I want to learn something about this area, and then you just go there and have a look? Or do you study maps and look at what exactly do you want to find and see?
It's a bit of both, really. Sometimes you can do some fantastic landscape spotting in the pleasure and comfort of your armchair with a laptop. You don't even need the paper maps anymore because everything's digitised, and you can look on the heritage records and you can cross-reference, and some of the old map systems have been digitised as well. So you can cross-compare modern Ordnance Survey maps, Google Maps. Google Earth is fantastic because you can kind of get a real sense of how things fit together in a way that you can't when you're on the ground looking at human level. Actually, sometimes that aerial perspective just lets things fall into place. And obviously with smartphones and iPads, tablets, you can do that in the field as well, which is really fantastic. There are certain places that I kind of think I want to go and see that, and I'm going to go and explore. And places that I like to go back to again. So Kilmartin Glen up in Scotland is a fantastic valley that's absolutely stuffed full of amazing prehistory. British rock art, there's another good one. British rock art, really weird, quite subtle, very, very unique to Britain. But then there's other places where you kind of just wander along and you see stuff, and because you've got half an idea of what you could be looking for, what questions you could be asking, when you stumble across something, you can sort of do that wandering and wondering and start to try and puzzle out. You might not come up with a black and white binary answer, but for me, the joy is in the adventure of discovery, not necessarily coming up with a kind of definitive answer. And you can always go back home and check, see what else other people have found out about a site.
Any more questions? Yep.
Thanks. Have most of the ancient sites in Britain pretty much been discovered, and pretty much using that book I will find things that are written on? Okay.
No, there's still more to be discovered. They found a whole stone circle up on Dartmoor not long ago. It looks like there's a kind of a whole crescent of stone circles, and it was under the peat. There's loads of stuff under peat. There's loads of stuff under thick vegetation. There's a chap up in Scotland who discovered, over the course of, I think, 15 years, he's found more than 2,000 panels of British rock art. So these are cup and ring marks. They're engravings into either earth-fast boulders or outcrops of stone. And you get like a little divot, a cup, and then you get a concentric circle, the ring. Sometimes you get multiple rings. Sometimes you get a groove that joins the rings, or a gutter that comes out from the middle. We don't really know why they were used. They're constructed in the late Neolithic and the Bronze Age. Maybe it was, they don't appear to be maps of any description, but because they're not coloured. They may have been coloured at one point or another. They may have been used to pour liquid onto oil or blood or milk to catch in some way as a kind of reading of the future, or perhaps as part of a ceremony. Other people have said that actually it's the grindings of the stone that were possibly the special thing, and what we're seeing now is sort of the cast-off, that just, you know, the empty shell of what was left behind, and they've taken the good stuff away. But we consider it rock art. It seems significant and special in its own right. But because it's normally quite low and it's quite subtle, and sometimes you can only see it if you get one of those like brilliant winter days, you know, really bright sunshine, but the sun is low, and so you get a real kind of cutting across. Things stand out much more clearly. So there's definitely more to be discovered. And every now and then, things will be rewritten because of finds and discoveries that amateurs have made.
Time for one more question. Yep.
Do you or any other organization organize the archaeological tours, like say for amateurs, not for professionals? Walks, yeah. Yeah,
there's a really good organisation called, oh God, what are they called? Dig Ventures. Dig Ventures, who crowdfund archaeology digs. And they've got a virtual dig, so that you can, if you can't get to the site and be part of it, then you can kind of follow along. They're really hot on sort of incorporating photogrammetry, imaging techniques, so that it's as, and then they open source publish all their findings. So they're really good. I definitely recommend them. And I'm also going to be doing some archaeological walks as well. Doing one in Ilkley, if anyone fancies a trip to Yorkshire. On my website, marianneochota.com. Yeah. Yeah, Ilkley, if you want to come and see some rock art, March, Ilkley. It's nice. Ilkley's really fun. Anyone been? Yeah, it's good, isn't it? Yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Marianne Ochota.
Thank you. Thanks.